Welcome to one of the final edits for Bases 2016. This is the second presentation of Igor Witkowski. Now, we originally had not decided to run with this edit because the raw recording suffered very severe audio distortion. However, in this particular audio recording, it's just about listenable too. So rather than throw away Igor's lecture on the basis of audio quality, I've decided to run with this. We're just going to put a couple of captions on it and put it out basically as a raw cut from the actual day. We did suffer a lot of technical problems, a lot of problems with the sound for the conference, and for this reason it's taken absolutely months to do the edits. We are going to have Igor Witkowski back in London on December the 17th at the Southgate Inn, and he's going to deliver basically this lecture and more with an awful lot more detail because we really didn't get him up to speed in the summer. It's a great honour to have Igor Witkowski back in the UK to do this lecture and in extended form in front of a very small restricted audience in the Southgate here in Devizes. That'll be on December the 17th, and we're going to cover that, just record it in the old-fashioned way, and that'll edit will hopefully get out sometime before Christmas or the New Year. Now, this is a very important subject because we're going to also have at that particular recording Michael Shrimpton, who has done an analysis of the assassination, or what he calls the assassination of Max Spears. On both occasions, both lectures are dealing with German secret intelligence information. This is information which is essentially behind the Nazis and behind the actual war, which, as far as the Germans were concerned, they never lost. This is very important implications in terms of the transhumanization agenda, the creation of human beings into cyborgs, the secret alien space program, the secret space program, and a whole pile of other thins. And the fact that James Casbolt is in the jail, where some believe the Nazis were here during the war with the consent of Churchill, where this transhumanization program was being done in the very early stages, which subsequently led to the program-generated life forms, which Barry King talked about. And Barry King's got some kind of connection with the jail, Earlstoke jail that Casbolt is in. I mean, this is only like 5 miles down the road behind me here. So we're getting a little bit local. We're bringing the German secret technology to Devizes with a strong smell of something which went on using dimensional physics. The important stuff about what Igor is talking about is counter-rotating plasma fields. This is scalar physics. This is really serious stuff. And we are talking about stuff that was being used 70 years ago. So Michael Shrimpton will be there. Igor will be there. But in the meantime, do try and suffer through this distorted audio in this lecture with Igor Witkowski. The content is very important, and do try to stick with this. As I say, we are having him back to do essentially this lecture again, and a lot more. So here we have Bases 2016, the rough cut, Igor Witkowski and Pewsey, the second lecture. Okay, welcome to Igor Witkowski for his second and final presentation here at Bases 2016. Thank you very much. And what is the subject of this presentation at the moment?
The subject of today's presentation is the so-called German bell, which is something that has been developed by the Nazis during the Second World War, and it is kind of a secret technology, also a breakthrough, a gateway for the future in a way.
Well, thank you, and immediately after your presentation we'll be joining Kerry Cassidy with Peter Paget live via Skype. But Igor, thank you very much. Continue.
Thank you. Yes, I will tell you about the project that I have been researching. It has been described in my book, The Truth About the Wunderwaffe, but people know it mostly from the documentaries that were made by Discovery Channel and History Channel and a couple of other channels. And the problem is that this documentary didn't contain too much substance, frankly saying, and yes, because it's the text they cut it into a single sentences essentially, and there is no way virtually to describe such an aspects like, for example, the technology or the science behind it, which is most interesting in my opinion, personally. Okay, so because I have been granted a permission from Miles to describe this perhaps more difficult aspects of this project, I would do it. But I will start from the essentials. I have, because neither in my book nor anywhere else there is any a technical drawing, a cross section or whatever of this device, and some graphic works that do appear in various sources have nothing to do with truth. Then I decided to start from the description what it was. But before that, I shortly tell you how it has happened that I started to do such a research at all. It has started in 1997. I was already writing many books about the history of science and technology in the Third Reich. Because, as I mentioned yesterday, I started as a military journalist, and I was mostly interested in technology. Excuse me, could you please okay, thank you. I do appreciate, and I think that all the others do appreciate as well. Okay, it started in 1997. I already wrote several books on the history of the technology in the Third Reich, and I have been contacted. I am from Poland, and I have been contacted by a guy from our intelligence who had something that some documents from the time referring to the times of the World War II to something so strange that in spite of many attempts by the secret services over many years, they have never been able to interpret it, the descriptions that were there in this documents, namely, shortly saying more simply, they just had no idea what the device described there was, or what it was for. It was so strange that in a perhaps desperate attempt, he has contacted me because I was already researching various documents. I did queries in various archives. I had some experience because so he had contacted me in order to ask me perhaps what it might have been, or whether I associated with anything, with any idea. Is it any familiar in any way? It wasn't. But it was very strange, and I decided to start such a research for two reasons. Essentially, the first reason was that it was described in these documents for several reasons. In fact, the first of them was that this device, which was codenamed the Bell, the Glocken in German, was described as something. The project was described as the most secret research project carried out in the Third Reich during the entire war by the SS, by the way. The second reason was that in these documents that I saw initially, I saw very few of them. Only later on during the years, I have managed to enrich this picture by finding various documents, by getting to various scientific sources and so on. But initially, I didn't know very much. I didn't know very much, excuse me. And but the second reason for me to start such a research was that there was a description of an experiment utilizing this device, and the description looks so strange for me, just so strange. The first associate, the device has been, connected to high voltage current, and started working in a way, I don't know how to say it, and generated, for example, surges in electrical installations at a distance of up to 150 meters, for example, emitted some glow, bluish glow, killed many people, was causing various strange changes in various substances that were tested in its vicinity, for example. It was something that my first association when I saw this description was one of the final sequences from the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark by Spielberg, and it greatly impressed me. So it was something very unusual, and at the first glance, it didn't resemble anything. What's all the more interesting is that, according to my source, in this case, this guy, there was never the word weapon mentioned in its context, in the context of this project. Anyway, it didn't match any known pattern to me, although I did have at the time already quite experience in getting to such a. I saw many German documents on technology, but one more reason was that this guy that has contacted me was. It was obvious at the first glance for me that he was a high-class expert. He was an analyst, but it was plain to me that he was serious. It was a serious person at a very high intellectual level and so on, high-class professional. Okay, that's how it started, and I started. Getting to various documents, to various sources of information, like among them, I started analyzing scientific works of the scientists that were mentioned in this context, because I wanted to check out what they were doing, even if not at the time of that this project was carried out. Then I assumed that perhaps if I will get to their publications from the time before the war, I will have some clue, such as some physical ideas as to the modus operandi of such a device and so on. So I started an extensive device, but the main information on the construction of the bell came from this intelligence source. Some of them have been verified later on, but they were quite unusual. The description referred to something that consisted of such a pedestal and was covered with a ceramic cover. And generally, it resembled the bow, because this part was cylindrical, this part was hemispherical, and this pedestal was of somewhat larger diameter, and inside of it were two cylinders, toruses, if you like. This part is one cylinder, which I'm showing, and this one is another. Inside of them, there was some amount of liquid mercury. This is an axis. The axis contains some strange substance, but I will not discuss this because we don't have that much time. and the entire device was powered by high voltage, very thick, very many high voltage electrical cables. And the operation of this device consisted in accelerating these cylinders, these toruses, in opposite directions, and a discharge of a high voltage electrical current took place inside of these toruses from the circumference to the axis, which evaporized the mercury and accelerated it through the flow of electrical discharge, and created two donut-shaped vortices of mercury plasma. Probably, as I wrote here, probably there were some systems inside of which I don't have any specific information, except for the fact, for example, that it was mentioned that the device consumed liquid air and liquid nitrogen, which might have been used for cooling, for example. There are some uncertainties here, but nevertheless the general idea seems to be clear. However, it seems to be clear, but it was very hard to explain or to connect with any modern physical knowledge, because it was clear that it was based on some exotic physical ideas. And I will not describe you how I came to the real explanation of the nature of this device, because it would take just too much time. But essentially, in the original intelligence documents were some clues. They were strange, but they were indeed. One of these were descriptions of German terms describing the phenomena taking place, or phenomena on which the very idea was based. One of them was vortex compression. Another one was separation of magnetic fields. It didn't match anything. It didn't mean anything to the people that were employed as scientific consultants by the intelligence before they contacted me. And it was strange, but I did manage to connect these pieces of the puzzle and to understand it. So to speak, substantiate my claims by specific references. And one of them, that it was known from the very beginning, I mean from these intelligence documents, who was the leading scientist of this project. It was Professor Walter, German professor obviously, Professor Walter Gerlach, who was one of the most outstanding German scientists at the time. And as it later turned out, in his case, people generally didn't know much about him. It was, as if he was a kind of a gray eminence, so to speak. One of the leading scientists of the Third Reich, which couldn't be connected later on after the war with any subject, specific subject. He was, for example, a chief of the so-called Reich's Scientific Research Council. He headed essentially the entire German physics. So he was really outstanding scientist. He almost even got a Nobel Prize before the war for an experiment that was called Stern-Gerlach experiment. but only his companion, Professor Otto Stern, has received Nobel Prize for this. He didn't, but it doesn't matter. Because I knew who was the head scientist of this project, which was, by the way, code-named. Initially, the code name was Tor, which means gate or gateway. Then it was divided into two sub-projects, if you like, which have received separate code names. One of them was Laternenträger, which means lantern bearer or something like that, and the other code name was Kronos, or Kronos, as you probably would pronounce. And this Professor Gerlach turned out to be and it was the pattern repeating itself in this case of almost all the entire personnel appearing in all the names appearing in this context of this project. He has turned out to be a very interesting scientist because he was following leads that were not continued after the war, and were very different from the mainstream of science generally. It was something that repeated itself. And by the way, another thing that was repeating itself was that he was an ardent Nazi, really ardent. For example, he was one of the 9, I guess, German physicists that were interned. How to say that? Kept anyway on a property in the United Kingdom after the war named Farm Hall, and the conversations between them were recorded and translated and so on by British intelligence. And for example, one of the strange elements that have surfaced from this episode was that he was crying after Americans dropped a nuclear bomb on Japan. As it has later turned out, his co-worker has testified that it wasn't that he was crying because of the death of I don't know 50 or 100,000 people, but he was crying because it wasn't Germans who dropped the bomb. Who managed to make the bomb. Anyway, he was a very interesting person, and what came out from my research was that in the 1920s, if I remember it correctly, he has observed a ball lightning, and described it in several scientific papers later on. But because he was researching, he was chief German researcher in the physics of the magnetic field and the spin. Spin is something that is spin is the spinning of an atomic nucleus or atomic particles. Then, therefore, he tried to explain this phenomenon. This is what you see on the picture is a modern ball lightning generated in a laboratory, in a German laboratory. What he was trying to do was to explain the nature of this phenomenon, of this thing, by describing it as a peculiar kind of a vortex, different in some way. He didn't know exactly initially in what way, but as a vortex of a different kind than generally all the vortices that we normally observe. And he has come to the conclusion that there are two kinds of vortices in nature generally. And this one represented the kind of vortices that are generally in some way or another separating themselves from the external environment generally, or external fields in particular. Because what was striking for him that if we will consider the fact that it is electrically charged hot plasma, plasma is ionized gas, then he asked himself a question: what is the difference between such a thing and a vortex of hot plasma generated, for example, during electrical welding, which leaves a very tiny fraction of a second? And why? He asked himself a question. Very tiny fraction. I mean, 100,000 part of a second, for example. He has asked himself a question: what is the difference here, and why it leaves for a minute, for example, which is up to 1,000,000 times longer, despite the high pressure inside that should destroy it, essentially. And in order to explain this, he has established contacts with Soviet physicist, laureate, winner of a Nobel Prize, professor, or in fact an academic. Academic was in the Soviet Union a degree higher than professor. Academic Piotr Kapica, of Polish origin, by the way, who has developed, as the only scientist in the world at the time, a theory, a mathematical description for such a vortices. He based on he came to essentially to the same conclusion, that there are vortices that are separating themselves from the environment, even although he was doing research on a different kinds of phenomena, which were the vortices in superfluid liquids, such as liquid helium, for example. But nevertheless, he has created a mathematical description, and on the grounds of this, Professor Gerlach came to the conclusion that it is a key to gravity, to controlling gravity. He has established a collaboration with other people. One of them was equally unknown after the war, brilliant German physicist specializing in gravity, in gravitation, whose name was Pascual Jordan. You would pronounce it Pascual Jordan. And later, shortly after the war, Jordan has published a theory of a very interesting theory of gravity, which was so strange, so different from the Einstein's description of gravitation, that he effectively it has been forgotten shortly after that. But nevertheless, this approach has turned out to be a giant gateway to control gravity. And the same approach we may test with testing superconductors presently, only that a plasma vortex, which provides the same kind of effect that was named by the Germans as separation of magnetic fields. In the case of superconductors, we cannot. The superconductor doesn't withstand too strong magnetic forces. I mean magnetic fields, and mechanically it also cannot be spinned at very high at such a high speed as in the case of plasma. Nevertheless, later on, the European Space Agency, later on, I mean around 10 years ago, the European Space Agency, ESA, or in fact its Department of Advanced Propulsion Systems, has initiated a research project which the purpose of which was to verify, to check out if in such a way by spinning and separating magnetic fields, spinning magnetic fields from the environment generally, if it is true that one may generate gravity quite effectively in such a way. And the conclusion of this research project, which lasted around 2 years or 3 years, was that the generation of gravity, or negative repelling gravity in fact, which is obviously anti-gravity, is 10 to 21st power stronger than the previous theories permitted. Which means that a device powered from a simple battery may generate really significant gravity loss. It's a breakthrough in science which leads to a completely new physics. It is something so new that despite the fact that it has been verified, such an approach has been verified by various institutions, the European Space Agency is just one of them, it's not the only one. Despite this fact, it is something so strange and so new for science that it hasn't been utilized yet. It has to, probably some time has to pass in order to, for the science, or the science, or the scientists in fact, to adjust to such a change in a way. I don't know how to name it, but you know that probably that science is quite conservative generally, and the main problem here is such that you have a direct link between electromagnetic forces and gravitation gravitation in this situation is generated as a form of as a result of something like an induction from electromagnetic forces, such as magnetic field is induced by electrical field in such a way, and it's a straight, simple and direct link between quantum physics and gravitation. The problem is such only that science is, our modern science is based on a non-quantum Einstein's theory, and in order to make any progress in this respect, it has to reject it. It has to replace it in order to connect the gravitation with other forces in nature. It has to go from non-quantum to quantum description, and it is something that so far seems impossible in our world. Yesterday I was speaking about conservatism of our world, and that it cannot perceive the information not matching the existing paradigms or patterns of perception. And this is another example of that. And but it is something very important, because this is Professor Gerle, by the way. I will come to this. But the importance of this German or Nazi heritage, if you like, is such that the modern scientific experiments and research projects confirm that indeed it is something far ahead of our world, not mentioning even the World War II. Excuse me. And therefore one may consider it a gateway to the future, because it's proven possible to verify, to check it out in a way to revolutionize our perception of the physical reality. It will have therefore tremendous impact on our entire science, but also, obviously, it's a gateway to the stars. Because whenever we will be able to replicate the UFO propulsion, which is what it is all about, in fact, then we will make a giant leap forward in terms of development of our civilization generally. It's something unprecedented, impossible to compare to anything that we knew from the past, anything else. It is something that is, as I mentioned, gateway to the future, and is it corresponds with the topic that I was discussing yesterday, which was a transformation of our world that was announced by various extraterrestrial civilizations. It corresponds in such a way that it is something that I have to say that the transformation is not just about destruction of the our mental aspect of our modern civilization, of our culture. It's not about destruction. There are also promises of the future, so to speak, and this is one of them. One of the very interesting things about it is that during some of the documents that I have managed to recover about this, about the German works on anti-gravity during the war, there are such documents, is that there was a description that this device, during the experiments with the bell, they have discovered that this device was generating electrons, in other words, electrical energy, the source of which has never been determined, as it was written in the document. Therefore, it seems likely, and there is also another source confirming this. Therefore, it seems likely that this entire technology is also a key to master new sources of energy, which is also something that would revolutionize our world whenever it could be implemented. Okay, that's generally about the technological aspect that I wanted to present. This is Professor Walter Gerlach. This is Professor Piotr Kapica, with whom Gerlach has developed this theory of this description of such vortices. This is something strange, a little bit strange. It is not verified. The source of it is unknown, in fact. I mean, I know where it comes from a magazine, but the original source of such a drawing is unknown. But what is interesting here, that and we should keep in mind that it is not certain. It is not certain what is shown here, but what is interesting here is that it is alleged cross-section of a German flying disc that was allegedly designed by them before the end of the war, that shows the bell. It is named here as the Glocke, and it is this generally. It presents the bell as a part of a much larger propulsion system. It seems that in this case they were being testing two alternative forms of such a propulsion. One of the bell type, if you like, which contained two toruses, one above the other, and the other form were the balls, I mean spheres, which were a slightly different approach to the same problem, namely that here were two spheres, one smaller inside the larger one, and spinning in opposite directions. So it was a sort of variation on the theme, and that's another such an example as I mentioned, unverifiable, which shows a bell, something very similar here to the drawing that I presented as the first one, and it also shows it as part of something larger generally. And it seems from one of these drawings here also it is visible, although not very clearly, that the axis that was inside this one was something that connected it with the rest of the propulsion system. But this part of this aspect of the story, if you like, is just a matter of speculation. I'm not sure about these drawings. Another thing is that it has been mentioned in the original intelligence documents that the entire project was carried out in a secluded valley in then southeastern Germany, which is now southwestern Poland, in the town then Ludwigsdorf. Now it's called Ludwikowice. And this is a thing that you may recognize from the documentaries, because you know, the television has such a I don't know how to name it, weakness to concentrate on anything that can be shown in front of a camera, not on the substance. And this is one of the things that is generating emotions, which is spectacular in a way, because it's quite large and perfect for the television. But it doesn't mean that they were interested in any in all the substance of the story generally, which I have to admit frustrated me each time. This structure might have been used for testing the barrel or some object, because my first association when I saw it was with a so-called circular test rig, such as of the kind that is used to test turbines or helicopters propulsion systems, like rotors with engines and so on. Some researchers have interpreted it as a supporting structure for a so-called cooling tower, but it doesn't seem to be the case because, for example, it is plastered, it is painted with green camouflage paint, which wouldn't withstand even one day in overheated water vapor. But it's another detail is that this structure was connected with a nearby power plant, a couple of 100 meters distant, with such a duct where there were high voltage electrical cables. One of them is photographed by me many years ago, because it doesn't exist anymore. This is the duct or tunnel underneath this structure, which is called the hinge, which such niches for high voltage electrical cables. It's just an example discovered recently, however, because the existence of these tunnels deeper, this one is quite deep, was not known 10 years ago or so. And this is a modern analogy. It's a similar structure for testing helicopters in the Institute of Aviation in Warsaw, Poland, which I photographed as well. But another interesting thing is that in this valley, in the town of Ludwigsdorf, it's a village, Ludwigsdorf or Ludwikowice presently, is that the area around the hinge is surrounded, despite the fact that the entire valley was secluded and the entrance was blocked at both ends of the valley, because there is a road that goes along. Despite this fact that it was closed off limits for any unauthorized persons, despite this fact, And despite the fact that the main part of this complex was deep underground, which might have another, checkpoints or barriers or security rings, whatever, despite these facts, the area within this valley, within this closed valley, is clearly divided into 3 additional security rings. Access control rings, if you know what I mean. This is a remnant of a gate, for example, marking one of such security rings, which is very unusual. This is another remnant of a gate. As you can see everywhere out there, the concrete roads, the infrastructure is fully developed. It's very extensive, I would say. But another even stranger thing is that these security rings are marked also with zigzagging lines of trenches, which are surely not, were not big for telephone cables or anything, because they are zigzaggy. If I'm correct, it goes more or less like this. There is another example where you have trench here, such a zigzagging trench goes somewhere like this, and it's very unusual, very hard to explain, because I remember when I've been there with a group of people, and one of them was a historian specializing in the history of German fortifications, and I have asked him if he has ever seen anything like this on the grounds of a industrial or research facility. He was greatly amazed, and it's clear that at least from this perspective, from this point of view, it is a unique place in the world generally, where you have a industrial complex, which is or industrial and research development complex or so on, having typically very heavy fortification like this infrastructure. It's like something that would be in the middle of a front line, or thought that it was deep in the mountains and the front line has never reached this place. So it certainly wasn't prepared to fight, in a regular combat. And it's something very unusual. Generally, they have built. They were building. They didn't finish it. A giant underground, a complex consisting of various underground facilities, and hundreds, if not thousands, of bunkers, various objects on the surface, which was code name Sonderbauvorhaben S3, which means a special construction undertaking S3. It was a project of the SS, of Kammler's project, if it does tell you something. And in one of the documents that I have recovered in a German archive, in this case, it was clearly stated that it was the greatest, the largest project of the SS. The document is from December of 1944. So it is certainly something. A new insight in the history of the Third Reich, or the history of technology, and final phase of the war and so on. And another interesting thing it is a detail that has attracted my attention initially when I saw these intelligence documents, was that it was stated in these documents that it was the most secret research project carried out. I'm not sure if I was telling it. carried out in the Third Reich during the entire war. And later on, I have found documents in a U.S. archive saying that it was officially classified as decisive for the war, which was the German economy, the German state had probably it was something similar in the UK as well. It had there was a system of priorities for the allocation of raw materials, workforce, and so on. And there are various stages, if you like, and the stage decisive for the war, quoted in reverse commas, it is clearly written in the document why it has been why such a classification, beyond any classification system, has been granted with reference to specific conference and so on. And one question arises, must arise, is that why? What might have been the justification for such an unusual priority, unusual degree of secrecy? And what has emerged, I'm saying it shortly. It's abbreviated version of the entire story. But I'm jumping from one aspect to another because I have no time to tell you the entire story. And one strange thing, I mean, maybe not strange but curious, worth remembering, was that they were the entire S3 secret underground complex, giant, because only the 2 minutes, only the underground facility underneath this valley, which was a former mine and a very large one, had underground space the order of 20 million cubic meters. I don't know how to translate into cubic feet or so, but it is something large, the size of a medium-sized city underground. Just this one facility underneath this this valley. And one should or might ask himself a question: what would be the what would be a credible justification for such a effort? And as it has turned out, they were planning to create strategic weapons that similarly, like for example, the V2 missiles, would be indestructible for the enemy. Because I don't know any case of intercepting flying V2 missiles. It was developing the speed of 5,500 kilometers per hour in the final phase of flights. And I have to comment on this, on the thesis in one of the previous lectures, that it didn't have any military value. It did have very high military value, because if they would decide to fill the heads of these missiles with the newest generation of chemical weapons, which were unstoppable by any filters, they would decimate the population of the United Kingdom with these V2 missiles without any military value. That's another aspect. They just didn't want to do this, but it doesn't mean that these missiles didn't have any military value. And the same would be in the case of such weapons, which would be impossible to intercept or shut down by Allied air defenses, and they wanted to create strategic weapons with a global range that could deliver weapons of mass destruction, such as the chemical ones, or in the future nuclear ones, to any populational center of the enemy. And that might have, or in fact it does explain why such a project was was officially classified as decisive for the war, because once they would create it, they would just win the war within a week or two. I have no doubt about it. So it's a very interesting page of history, interesting from the point of view of history itself, but also, as I mentioned, it's a gateway for the future, perhaps the most important gateway that is opening in front of our eyes. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Igor. Now, I am so fascinated by this, especially since we had a Brit on a few minutes ago, and your information and his information seem to be incompatible. But I know you have more on this.
Mutually complementing.
Good. Well, perhaps we can get you back for a Bases at some period of time, maybe in London, where at High Elms Manor. And maybe we can have a chat before you leave to get more of this actual detail of that. But in the meantime, we are going to have Kerry Cassidy online very soon in a few moments' time. And thank you for coming from Poland.
My pleasure.
And you were appeared at the relevant conferences, which were so tragic for Max. If you want to say anything on that.
I would just like to add that. Why I'm doing this? I'm doing this because I think that it is something that is really important for the entire humanity. It's not just a history. It's something really very important, and I consider it my mission to spread the truth about such things.
Now, very briefly, just before you go, John Irwin, who we had a couple of days ago, was very, very cagey when he was speaking on Skype, and it was significant that his picture was frozen and unable to move. He explained to me that the bell, when it was operating, it disappeared, took everybody with it, and even the low loader that it was brought on. That's what his information is. What do you feel about that? Everything except the tires.
No, it's just. For me, frankly saying, it's just an invention, as one of many that I have encountered, because even the television stations or TV producers have added sometimes some details, such as inscriptions, in some hieroglyphic inscriptions on the circumference of the bell. It's all not true.
Well, maybe soon we can get further answers to those questions from you. Igor Witkowski from Poland, thank you so much. Good night. Okay, we are now going to configure now for a Peter Paget with Kerry Cassidy. If you want to get a quick smoke break, we'll get Kerry Cassidy online and be on that as soon as possible. We must leave fairly soon and de-rig, and that includes all the chairs.